accurate. I think there's a growing appreciation of the need to view systems as systems instead of as these disparate parts that you can look at individually. I don't think we're there on helping people do that. I think people are recognizing the importance of doing that and saying, like, okay, let's be interdisciplinary, but not so much setting up systems that actually help people figure out how to do that, because I don't think it's necessarily, certain great habits of mind will always be intuitive for certain people, but I don't think I think people view this as something intuitive, like just be broader, just integrate, but it's actually something that has to be learned, like a lot of other things, and it shows up everywhere. It's very much akin to what you're talking about with the hamstring. We can know much more about this sort of reductionist view of things, and at the same time kind of less about what's going on in the greater system. And I think it's an important question to ask of, should our priority be on knowing more at this granular level, or figuring out how to make the things we already know work, be integrated in the system and understood in this greater system? But really what you need to do is set up a system by which these parts like work together, basically, instead of just assigning it separately. And so if you don't have anyone who's looking at the whole system, you will necessarily every time end up with these perverse outcomes where everyone's blaming the next person instead. But I spent some time with the analytics team at UPS, okay? And I would have never thought that UPS would be a fascinating company, right? Like whatever, like kind of brown trucks and like packages. But they have they deal with what's called the traveling salesman problem, which is what's the most efficient way to get between a certain number of stops? That's the traveling salesman problem. And it's become a much bigger problem now with e-commerce. So they used to have 40 stops a day. Now an average driver has like 150 stops a day. And so that caused what's called combinatorial explosion. There's so many different, there's like more different possibilities than like atoms in the universe and ways to do that. It's remarkably complex. Mm-hmm. And so there's not even a perfect solution that's known for this. They're just sort of local best solutions. So the way that computer algorithms try to solve this problem is just by trying a bunch of stuff and improving like one step at a time. But then you put that in the real world and you're dealing with traffic and like fuel economy and all these other things in context. And so they have this incredible analytics team that spends all their time like working on the traveling salesman problem and then integrating that into their drivers, and they make everyone work as a delivery person. The CEO of the company had worked as a delivery person. The mathematician on the analytics team works as a delivery person, because what they found was that working on the algorithm was difficult, but the most difficult was what they called change management. How do you incorporate this into what people are actually doing every day? And I think to give them the kind of insight they needed for that, they basically took them away from what the main job is. I mean, that's a pretty hard thing to do, to take a mathematician away and say, you're going to work in the delivery truck for a little while, to understand how some of this works. And I think that's a risk, because you're taking time away from their specialty, right? So you have to really be willing to invest in it. But again, even the CEO there, worked as a delivery person. And I think that gave their team much better understanding of the realities they were dealing with. Where on the opposite end of the spectrum, I was contacted by an NBA team that I think I'm not really supposed to like name them, but it doesn't matter what team they are anyway, where they wanted to, get more into sports science. And so they hired like a very prominent scientist as their sports science coordinator. And a year later, we're like, basically what he does is say, well, here are the results from the labs, do with them what you will. And they parted ways not so amicably, because that's not useful, right? What you needed someone who knows how to find things out, understands that the coach is the decision maker. How does this stuff aid his decision making, as opposed to saying, well, here are these results from this. Basically, what to the coach is a vacuum. It might as well be a vacuum, I bestow them upon you, do what you will. But really, that physiology should be, it's subservient to your decision making, right? I think of this even in, like, if I talk to creative writers who go through an MFA program, they're like, you learn all these rules of writing, and then you kind of like forget them. They're there if you need them to help your decision making, but you don't want that stuff to be running you. Like, you want to be running it. And so I think, with how much science is available and how much emphasis there is on like having the credential of being a science person, it can really be lost the fact that that's supposed to serve the decision making, not the other way around.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. You go back 250 years and Goethe and what he was talking about with holism and the importance of not getting too focused on the details of something, and making sure that we we synthesize as well as analyze, and then Hegel, and then systems thinking, and complexity science, and chaos engineering, all of these things. And we understand it, we know it, we see the importance of it, but we don't do anything about it. Is it simply just because it's a bridge too far and it's too difficult for us, or is there some other motivation to more reductive means, or maybe it's just tradition and this is the way it's set up, and this ship is just too difficult to turn around?
That's a great question, and also reminds me of something I should have added to your last point. So I hope you don't mind if I digress.
No, please. Yeah.
Which is, if I had to think of what I think is one of the most important things for trying to foster this integration that we're talking about, where that I think people increasingly recognize as important, but somehow leave up to its own devices if it's just going to materialize, is having a strong informal culture in an organization. So I think there are a lot of organizations that have strong formal culture. They have their processes laid out, they have their identity, and those sorts of things, but do not have very strong informal culture. So it's related to the question you asked, because it's not as sexy of an answer as, build the Google Open Office plan and whatever other hacking types of things you have to have. But I do think that having strong informal culture is, to go with strong formal culture is a major part of what sort of foments that. People get interested in each other and start to want to understand how the rest of the place works. But I think there are a lot of forces that augur against that. The drive to reductionism and specialization, I think some of it is signaling, right? But signaling's been on my mind a lot because of this college admissions crisis that we're looking at. And it's like with anything, I can't remember the name of what this law is, though I could look it up, where as soon as something becomes a measure, it becomes a status symbol, and then the measure itself becomes an end as opposed to progress.
Yep.
And I think specialization has a huge signaling benefit. I mean, I can feel for myself whenever I move niches in work, it's really psychologically unsettling. There's a woman, an engineer, who's one of the corporate scientists at 3M that I talk about in the book a little. Corporate scientist means they're like one of the 20 biggest contributors, kind of. That's the highest title. She was telling me, I'm not that great a scientist. I'm not even working in the field that I trained in at all. But I call my process mosaic building, where I have an idea, I start going around and talking to some of the specialists that are in our office building, and I put one tile in the mosaic at a time. They don't know what each other are doing. Eventually, I've got this full picture where I'm like, you guys are all doing work that bears on one another, but don't really know it. And it leads to me having this question that, I can get people involved in. And she became, really incredibly successful that way. When I would talk to people like that, they would say well, I'm doing it wrong. I don't do what you should do, which is just pick a specialty and drill into it, even though they had been incredibly successful in doing that. So I think a lot of it is just about credentialing, and kind of psychological security, and this feeling that there's so much knowledge that if you want to be able to add value, you have to spend so much time just getting to the frontier of a specific area of knowledge, and less value on the idea that really can add knowledge. That was a bit of a revelation for me, even as a writer. I figured once I left science, when I was living in a tent in the Arctic doing geology research, and started to think, it's getting so specific. Am I the type of person who wants to spend my whole life learning one or two things new to the world, much shorter spans of time learning things new to me and translating that? Was the latter. Then I also sort of realized later, because the people who are like what I was at that time don't know, are in this system of parallel trenches where there's useful stuff in the next trench, but they're not standing up and looking down at it. You actually can add knowledge value by integrating some of what they're doing and letting them know what other people are doing. So I sort of feel like actually, instead of just translating, and maybe I'm being too kind to myself, you actually can add a form of knowledge in the form of this sort of integration, because it's not going to happen by itself. So it provides opportunities, I think, for people like me, basically.
Yeah.